So good evening, everybody. My name is Joel Towers. I'm the Dean of Parsons, and on behalf of my colleagues at the New School, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this special keynote address by Professor Terry McGee. His talk, is part of a two-day conference. Many of you have been participating in the conference during the last couple of, or yet today and tomorrow. But there are also many new members of the audience for tonight's talk. So Terry, you're drawing a bunch of people in, which is great. And we thank you for that. And the conference, New Urban Forms, New Fields of Inquiry, China and India, was organized by the India-China Institute. EC, as we call it, the India-China Institute, I have been associated with from its very beginning 10 years ago. And so we're also celebrating anniversaries in that way. My association with the India-China Institute is both friend and faculty advisor. And really from the time more recently that Mark Fraser and various other scholars joined the EC team, there's been a concerted focus on engaging with questions related to urban transformations. In many ways, that builds on the India-China Institute's earlier work on globalization and urbanization, as well as connects to conversations across the entire New School. And so it's really a core part of what we do at the New School in this very cross-disciplinary way, this connection between the social sciences and design, policy and planning that brings together the unique characteristic of this institution. So the India-China Institute is at the heart of that, and very ably and expertly directed by Ashok Gurung. So we are very pleased with the work that goes on there. At the outset of this talk, I did want to thank Professor McGee for delivering the keynote address today. Many of you know him, but for those of you who don't, and I'm not sure that there's anybody who doesn't because he's really done so much extraordinary work in this field, but let me say a few words of introduction just in case. He is a geographer and a social scientist and has worked on the larger thematic of urbanization for the last 50 years. He's carried out research on subjects as diverse as Indian international migration, Malays rural-urban migration to Kuala Lumpur, street vendors in Manila, Jakarta, Bangkok, Penang and Hong Kong, urbanization in China, India, and Southeast Asia. During this time, he has constantly worked on issues such as the context and the theory of and the role of comparative studies in understanding urban phenomena and some of the systemic themes that the organizers of this conference have identified, such as the very meaning and the shifting meaning, as we talked about quite a bit today, of rural and urban itself. He's also focused on the informal sector and urban expansion. He's the author of numerous influential books, monographs, and articles on urbanization in Southeast Asia, China, and Latin America. He has led several influential projects on urban development and the effects of environmental change on mega-urban regions. He was the director of the Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia from 1978 to 1988, and again from 1993 to 1998, as well as professor of geography from 1978 to 2001. In 2009, he was awarded the Distinguished Van Turenlud International Prize in Geography for his contributions to development geography. It is an honor and a great pleasure to welcome Terry to this stage.
Well, thank you, Joel, for those kind words. I just wanted to thank Mark and other people in the ICI for the invitation to talk to you. I must admit that when it arrived, my schedule wasn't looking too brilliant, so I had to try and carve out a bit of space to do it, and I hope that what I'm going to talk to you about is going to be okay, but I'll wait for the reaction. Basically, I wanted I've prepared a paper, and it's actually been, I think Mark is going to make it available to people at some point. So It's quite a long paper. It runs to about 38 pages, and it's got a lot of stuff in it. So I can't, for 1 minute, address all the issues that paper writes, but I will, during the course of my presentation, point out some parts of it which I'm not going to discuss, and you can certainly consult them when you see the paper. I wanted first and the other point is that because of the shortage, because of a very short period of time to present, I want to just kind of give an overview of the written paper. So some of it will be kind of shorthand, and I hope that the ideas get across to you when that is presented. I want to make, in the introduction to the paper, I deal with a number of issues which I think recur in the paper, and I just wanted to tell you about them. First of all, to me, comparing urban spaces is the term I like to use instead because it's so vague and it enables you to skirt around the edges a lot. In comparing urban spaces, I've been doing this because I'm a Southeast Asianist. I work in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia consists of 11 nations at varying levels of development, hugely different cultures, different languages, different cultures of governance, so many different aspects. At least in theory, they look very different from the situation of China and India, where one of the great German Orientalists called the high POC society, or the high societies, meaning, of course, that they were very homogeneous in their character. So I had to learn comparison. And there's all sorts of methodologies about comparing things, like urban spaces or people or whatever. But to actually compare processes over a long period of time is very challenging indeed. And I have begun to think that writing about comparative investigations is really an art. It's kind of a skill that you have to develop by practicing it a lot. And you might hopefully have a little innate ability to do it, but it is not something which you can neatly prepare a formula for, a methodology for, that will give you all the answers. And that's particularly affected by the fact that the theoretical and contextual aspects of the study of comparative studies are so intertwined, and so many different aspects of that affect the kind of comparative conclusions that you make. So I stand in front of you very modestly as someone who's been trying to learn the art of comparative studies. I also want to emphasize right at the beginning how important India and China are in the general global condition of urbanization. And that's a theme I'll return to. But here you have the two largest countries in the world. Both of them, in a sense, even though we've heard today from various people, the sort of statistical basis of their urban condition is highly suspect. And thus, even though we don't really know if it is that either India or China are urbanized, we know that they're undergoing some form of process which is seeing change in urban spaces, but we don't really know whether they're in an urban condition, whatever that may be. And I think that's also subject to change through time. And I have some thoughts at the end of the paper about what I think we have to think about urban condition in, say, 50 years, by which time I'll be long gone. But so in the introduction, I begin by a quote from a really when I was writing the paper, I had a lot of problems getting the organization of the paper. I suspect everyone has that at some point in their academic life. So I took off to see a movie. It happened to be called The Postman and Il Postino, and it was a movie about the banishing of Pablo Neruda to a small island off the coast of Italy, not the first person to be banished to small islands off the coast of Italy. And his interaction with the postman, who in 1950s, when he went, early 1950s, brought him the post from his friends and family and all over the world, in Chile and all over the world. In this interaction between the two of them, the postman was the son of a fisherman and a part-time farmer, growing wine or whatever, and had grown up in what probably was uncontestably a rural life at that point in time. And he came in contact with Pablo Neruda and told him about his problems that he was having with his fiancée, who was a town person, and he was very inarticulate. So Pablo Neruda started writing poetry for him to take with him to give to his potential wife or fiancée. And at the same time, they engaged in much discussion, as Pablo Neruda was a communist, about inequality and societal injustice. And so this rather simple postman began to change. He married his fiancée, and Pablo Neruda, speaking at the wedding ceremony, quoted a poem about this event. And just at that point, a telegram arrived. I don't know how a telegram got into at that point, but it seemed to be a telegram saying that Pablo Neruda's exile had been ceased and he was able to be taken back. He could go back to Chile. So he went. But meanwhile, that rural postman became involved in political activity. And he lived in the town, and he was killed in a demonstration. Now, it's a very sad little vignette, but what it indicates is that change in whether it be an urban or rural occurs at all scales. It's multi-scalar. It occurs globally, it occurs nationally, it occurs regionally, it occurs locally, and it occurs most importantly at the individual level. I know that the history of Western sociology, and by Louis Wirth and others, has always argued that urbanness grows out of being in urban places. I don't actually agree with that, but nevertheless, it happened in this occasion through the exogenous forces of Pablo Neruda in this ruralized village town in this island off the coast of England. So I want to remind you that when we are talking about comparative studies, we must get the scale established. And that's not the only thing we must do as well. The other point I wanted to make is about the use of the word edge in the thing, and I will just go to that. Yeah, I talk about the urban edge, and in fact, before I do that, I jumped because I got carried away a little. I want to begin with two quotations. The first is from Zhu Rongji, and it's simply talking about something I heard today in one of the presentations. Urbanization in China cannot copy the patterns of other countries, and we must take a road to urbanization with Chinese characteristics. Well, I heard people today being a little skeptical about that, but nevertheless, I think it's very important because it does emphasize that in situ urbanization at these various scales is a really important part of the process in comparative studies. And the second theme that I wanted to stress in this paper is that the growth of urban places is presenting a huge challenge to the growth of sustainable urban areas. And most of you in this audience know why this is. Urban places make great demands upon ecosystems. They make great demands upon resources and hinterlands. They make great demands that affect the ecological systems of which urban places are part. And so this is also linked to broader processes of climate change, etc., that are creating issues of sustainability in urban areas, environmental sustainability. And so I took this quote just to remind you, the second one by Graham Horton: "It is futile and indeed meaningless to attempt to create a sustainable city in isolation from its broader hinterland area." And one might say from its broader hinterland area in the sense of national and global context. So I wanted to remind you of that. Oh, sorry. Quick note, we've talked about it, 50 years as a comparative urbanist. At one time I sort of bought into the idea of homogeneity of Asia as a Western construct. But I became very critical of that. Southeast Asia is a special place. Context of urbanization, great variations. Southeast Asia constantly challenges conventional wisdoms of the urbanization process. Agricultural involution to urban involution. These are all papers that I've worked on. Vietnam planned capitalism, or the socialist transition to capitalism. Urban informality, hybridity. So many aspects of Southeast Asia are important. And finally, learning the art of comparison. Pass over that. Secondly, the use of the urban edge. I use this in the sense of a two-edged sword. Firstly, most of my work has been on urban spatial expansion into areas which have primarily non-urban activities. And this is very important to analysing issues of urban-rural transformation. So most of the examples which I have written about in the paper come from this work. The second part of the two-edged sword is, in fact, that urban comparative research is at the edge of the processes of knowledge formation on urbanization theory and information, for that matter. We've developed something called urban studies, which has tended to be a kind of discipline which has urban geography or urban economy or urban sociology or so on, which are in a sense disciplinary. But we haven't been very effective in developing holistic theory to look at urban spaces. That doesn't mean to say that disciplinary studies of urbanization are not important. They are important. Today we saw many papers that indicated that they're important. But there is also a need to see urban places and urban spaces within an interactive framework. And I'll have more words to say about this. Jamie Peck, a colleague of mine at UBC, has just finished a paper which he's analysed these sorts of problems. And he talks of an urban impasse, meaning that we seem to have sunk down into an area where we've been unable to advance holistic theory of urban areas, urbanization, urban spaces. And I recommend that paper to you. It's in the bibliography to the third point to make. Comparison is complicated. That's pretty obvious, but I just wanted to stress it. So how did I want to structure this presentation? I wanted to look at 4 questions. First, the question of what I call the urban problematique, which is really, what is urbanization? Someone asked that question today. I think it was you, Mark, actually. And where's it going? Where's our interpretation of it going? Our theory and our contextual studies. The second question, which was raised in the memorandum that set forth the some of the areas of investigation is how can context, which means particular studies, contextual studies, and theory intermesh to aid the study of urbanization process at different spatial scales of the constructs of global, regional, national data. Third question is, what kind of research interventions are needed? This is about practice. How do we practice comparative research? It's very interestingly positioned institutionally in transnational contexts, and I'll talk about that briefly. And finally, what are the strategic research questions? Currently, as for many thousands of years, debates about the nature of urban have continued. It's not new. Rooted in the concept of rural-urban dichotomy, which has remained remarkably persistent. It defines statistical definitions of urbanization on many occasions. It defines the occupational definition of urbanization. It defines the sociological interpretation of urbanization. And yet, we live in a world in which the rural or rurality is declining rapidly. In the late 20th and early 21st century, this interpretation has also been challenged by processes of globalization, integration, and its effect on urbanization. And this is also reinforced by statistical representations of urbanization, which suggest the world is becoming urbanized, although, as many of us learned today, we want to treat that with some skepticism. The normal conventional view of this is shown in the slide. The green is rural and the other colors are urban. And I just simply show that the predictive increase of the urban condition up to 2030 and beyond is for an inevitability of urbanization, at least in the minds of many people who deal with it. Again, I have some skepticism about that. I would say the inevitability of what forms of urbanization. Also, this growth of the concern with globalization and global interaction has affected the balances of urban research. Saskia Sassen, who I admire immensely, really started the ball rolling on this with her work on global cities. And it kind of steamrolled a whole body of work on global cities and megacities, etc. And this kind of moved away from contextual studies at the local level. Brenner and his associates in the recent book have suggested that what we are seeing in urbanization is the growth of a form of planetary urbanization. That is, urban is everywhere by many different definitions. That doesn't mean to say that rural does not exist and rurality does not exist, but it is increasingly becoming a prevailing form of activity at the spatial level. The arguments that support this, of course, are the growth of megacities. And here I just want to stress that this diagram shows you very clearly just how important India and China are in this mega-urban process. They have about 60% of the global urban, mega-urban population. However, Saskia's work has been criticized because it focuses on an attention that is heavily concentrated in developed countries. Most global cities, as she would define them, are located in developed countries. And Robinson, in particular, has drawn attention to the fact that the majority of global urban population doesn't live in extraordinary cities, but actually in ordinary cities. So that is an important counter-argument against this thrust for looking at large global cities, most of them located in the developed world, etc., and moving us along. The next thing I want to say is it's very important here when one is looking at theory in context, which is question 2, that we want to explore, to me as a geographer, as someone who has found my entree to the world of urbanization through the context of spatial formation of urban areas, which is very Lefebvrean, but I find it to be something that is easily manageable in terms of transferability into cross-comparative studies. Whereas much more difficult if you're talking about culture or you're talking about economic activity, many different, much more complicated. There are 3 dimensions to this urban transformation that I want to point out. One is first what I call telescoping transitions. I don't call it. Peter Marcatello, who is in NYU, coined this phrase. Second, transcending networks. And thirdly, urban expansion. This diagram just quickly shows you China. All these are in relation to the number of years they did it. One is Mexico, one is England and Wales, to reach a 50% level of urbanization. China did this from a point in roughly around about 2000 or 1998 to 2011 or 12 in the space of just about 12 years, where it took England 100 years, et cetera, et cetera. So what you have is a huge volume of people in India and China who are at least engaging in the urban transition, although the dimensions of how that's occurring is open to all kinds of analysis and deconstruction. Second point is globalization, the transaction environment. Undoubtedly, the system of globalization has integrated a new system of cities and relationship between urban spaces. I tried to do this by just taking a sort of imaginary world globe and banging it with a sledgehammer, making it flat. These are the global cities. These are the global cities that are standing up with the secondary cities are there, and the mega-urban regions and others are developing like that. Now, it's not a perfect diagram. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the beauty of some of the work that David Shane has done with 4-dimension and working, and I need him to do one for me, actually. Secondly, there is territorial expansion. This is Kuala Lumpur. The red is urban, and this is the period from 1928 to 2008. Yeah. So what you see there is a very small dot of urbanization, which becomes spread. So that's very typical of virtually all larger urban and secondary cities as well, increasingly at a global level, not only just in Asia. I also thought about what are the implications of this to the kind of internal divisions of space. I did this in an earlier paper in 1991, in which I wrote about Disickhora as being the area of hybridity between rural and urban on the peripheries of built-up areas of urban areas. And I actually, in the first version, I actually did a triangle, which was India. So it's perhaps ironic that this one turned out to look like China, although they're both hypothetical, okay? I would hasten to add. So in this model, I began to think about what are the implications if the spread of hybridity begins to spread across as urbanization increases. This is a completely new form. We would see perhaps 60% of urban condition in these areas in which rural and urban activity interacted. And why do I think this condition is interesting and important? Because I think it is one response to the challenges of sustainability, that the models of highly energy-using, resource-demanding city forms in the cores of our mega-urban regions create. Anyway, I throw that out, and I have some thoughts in the conclusion as to what it means in terms of design and thinking about it. Another form that is emerging are corridors. Generally in East Asia, they have been on the basis of railways, fast railways, Shinkansen between Tokyo and Osaka, and Taiwan and Korea, and now, of course, in China. This map was drawn before China put through its two big north-south railway systems. Of course, it had already arterial freeway systems, which are also forming corridors. But this is another form of urban space that is emerging. And there's nothing new in this. John Gottman wrote about this in 1960, something like that, about megalopolis between Boston and Washington. So it's been around, but it's taken a long time to get any traction. So putting theory in context, what I think we need to do is to use theory, and I've done it a lot in my work, but I want it to be something I want to engage, not something I want to dominate my thinking. So my work on rural urban migration among Malays challenged the rural-urban continuum. My work on Disickhora challenged the ideas of rural-urban difference in space. My work on the informal sector challenged the idea that informal and formal were separate. In fact, you can't imagine an economic space which has informal and informal activities not being interactive. And in fact, in papers I have argued very strongly that an informal sector is very desirable at certain points of development for the formal sector because it cuts costs. It keeps wages down. It provides the government an excuse not to provide social welfare. All those things are important. But one consequence of this global gaze that I talked about, this gaze that I talked about before, is that urban spaces are being represented less as organic social entities. And we heard today a paper about villages in Guangzhou, and they certainly have some organic social identity, that is for sure. We talked about that. Embedded in their regional hinterland and more as nodes in a matrix of regional flows, the capital subsume internal dynamics of urban change. So let's not think that theory determines what is research in comparative studies. What it does is it provides a challenge for the future. However, we need a more encompassing framework. We don't want to ignore the endogenous processes. In work that I did on rural-urban migration over a period of Malays, I worked with Malay colleagues on a study of Malay women factory workers from speech marks, rural areas. In that study, we had to look, these women were moving to semiconductor factories. They were on the assembly lines of semiconductor factories. They're coming from highly Islamic backgrounds where everyone said they'll never go. And they went very fast and became income earners. And then they sent their income back to the household from which they came, where they spent it on consumption and various other investments. So immediately this process created a situation in which the rurality was being challenged by the contextual changes that were occurring. So it leads to different trajectories of urbanization and result in contextual hybridity. I don't want to dwell on this. These are discussed in the paper. They're just examples of the work that I talked about. Practice of research. This is very practical. Comparative research has to be set in a particular practice context. In my view, there's an institutional context, there is the methodologies that are going to be applied, and there's the issue of how do you scale up contextual research to wider generalizations, which is a pretty old question which has been around research a lot. Institutional context. There is a regulatory framework now in place, not only for transnational research, but also for national research, that is governed by the issue of who owns knowledge. And it grew out of the post-colonial era, and it grew out of various other developments in social theory about the possession and construction of knowledge. But they include access to research sites. This is terribly complicated. You have to get permission to work in a research site, which in cross-comparative research may mean having permission to get in 4 different places. And that is a difficult task. Subjective research. Often these research submissions are evaluated not by academics, but by, as in Malaysia, by the Prime Minister's Department. And they are looked at for political content. So if you happen to be quite legitimately investigating an issue that is concerned with the political economy of a given place, then it's quite likely you have to be very careful how you devise your research title and strategy. Methodologies are also very difficult, depending on the scale you're operating on, etc. And they involve a great deal of discussion, particularly if you're involved in transnational techniques, because you're often dealing with colleagues in another national site whose view about how you approach this issue is different. It's quite legitimate from your own or the other members of any team you might have developed. And you need permissions. And permissions are often nowadays given at national, subnational, local level. When I was working in Indonesia, I went to work on a site in the south of Java. I went with a letter from the Bappenas Secretary General, which is the think tank for the Indonesian government, saying I should be permitted to do work. The local leader said no way. So this business of trying to get permission is very important indeed. Now it has to also be inclusive. Researchers, it's very necessary to involve your transnational research with national researchers. It's almost a given that teams have to be constructed which satisfy that requirement, or interdisciplinarity, or subject specialization, or something or other. Preparation of proposals therefore becomes lengthy. You've got to submit them to your research funding agency, you've got to submit them to the places you're going to work in. This takes a long lot of lead time to do. I'm not talking about anything you don't know about, but I want to remind you about it. And what are the research design or research methodology responses to this that I see? First of all, one level is to do it at a kind of what I call a GIS level. That is, you create networks and you do everything by digital interaction. But you have meetings occasionally. But that as a form of research misses out on the fact that when you're working with national teams of researchers in cross-national research, you absolutely have to be talking in contextual situations in which they explain their understandings and the operation of the processes in their countries to the other team members and to yourself or whatever leaders are involved in the process. Secondly, you need interdisciplinarity, and you have the possibility of interdisciplinarity depending on the subject. And I emphasize that's very important indeed, but it's not easy to do. Universities are organized on the basis of disciplines, although some try to create schools and other forms of interaction. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. But I think that interdisciplinarity in urban studies, in urban research is very important. Thirdly, scaling up. This is a challenge. Some people say that the particular turn or contextual investigation that uses grounded research establishes the micro-social contours of rapidly urbanizing landscapes that work that is done at other levels isn't able to do. And therefore it can provide insights, intuitive insights sometimes, but factual insights to macro theory that can be used to shape and reformulate theory. But this argument only convinces if the units of analysis are carefully established for understanding of what they represent in the particular context, and all people understand that. Otherwise, you're writing about eggs when you should be writing about, I don't know, something else, T-bone steaks. The final thing I want to say is that the conflating of city and urban unit of analysis is something that is a bit of a bug with me. If you read popular journalism, they're always talking about cities. They never talk about regions. They never talk about mega-urban regions. They may talk about mega-urban cities, but the mega-urban cities is another contradiction in terms. Because cities are in mega-urban regions. They're not mega-urban cities. So we need to bear that in mind. I illustrate this with a cross-national study of street vendors in Southeast Asia that we did, which was mentioned in the introduction. Finally, conclusion towards new fields of inquiry, and I know I'm probably going over time, but I did start 10 minutes late, if that's any argument. To conclude, I just want to focus on new fields of inquiry. And I think that one area should be to focus on issues of the policy dimensions of urbanization in both national and global contexts in China and India. I think it's very important to do that. Not the only thing that is done. There are many other aspects of urbanization which also have to be done, but the policy implications are, to me, of major importance. And I say that because in my life I have been mixing policy with actual contextual research, so that I think I understand some of the implications of that. We should be doing this because what is going on in India and China is absolutely crucial to what is going on at a global level, just simply because of the size of the population, rate of growth, all these other things that are occurring. They have to be understood, they have to be seen as something which have implications to, for instance, the issues of global climate change, etc. So I suggest that one should be looking at issues that, I use the word environment, really I think surround the whole issue of sustainability of urban regions and urban spaces. This is really important. I see that as the major challenge to the 21st century. How are urban regions going to be sustained in relation to the resource demands that they are placing upon our society? Now, of course, everybody says, but gas, went down, it plummeted. Immediately that happens, America starts selling these big, heavy, gas-guzzling cars. So, there are no lessons to be learnt in this except that everybody is going to do what they think they want to do, etc. Urban development infrastructure is really important, but I think we have to be really thinking about how do we develop infrastructure in large mega-urban regions or mega-urban or corridors. And it's not the same as developing infrastructure for built-up cores of urban regions. And we haven't been thinking enough about that. I think there are design solutions, I think there are planning solutions, and I think there are systems based upon ecosystems. New urban societal forms. Is it too too impossible to think that one might live in a condition of rural-urban fusion in the future? Why do we have to think we have to live in large urbanized, built-up environments? I heard some echoes of this, or little ideas of this coming from one of the presenters at the papers today, who talked about, two actually talked about it, diffuse urbanization as a viable form of urban shape form activity. And we have to think about new systems of government and governance for such regions. We have completely inadequate systems for governing mega-urban regions. I don't mean by that the state is governing. The whole system of interrelations between the private sector, civil society, and government, as they are operating in urban areas as a rule, are just not operating very well in the developing countries of the world at this point. That's not to say that people are not good at what they're doing, it's just that the institutional forms are fossilized. And they, the Industrial Revolution led to a technological change that changed the structure of the world. In the same way, the invention of some form of diffuse urbanization is one response to the challenges that are going to emerge from sustainability. So I would say topics: what's the role of urban ecosystems in creating sustainable urban systems? Well, lots of work on this, but there isn't much general cross-comparative work done, at least in my understanding. How do we create economic growth in diverse economic spaces? What we are seeing now is economic growth in one economic space, urban space. That's the city core and the surrounding areas. I mean, sure, on the periphery they're plonking down enclaves of industry and all this stuff, but that's what's occurring. And we need new systems of governance and management. Planning and design challenges. I don't know who is in the areas where I have no competence at all, planning and design. I don't know who is thinking about how you design urban space for diffuse urbanization. I haven't read a paper on this. I've seen people who have raised issues about it. But I think it's really challenging and important. And also informality, service shortfall, rural-urban land use conflict, environmental protection. Things that could be done: we can capture capital from land use conversion. We heard lots of talk about this. Solly Angel has been writing about this in his book on urban expansion. He says, why don't we just capture some proportion of the capital that is presently being taken by municipalities, put them into a fund to fund the service delivery in the peri-urban regions of diffuse urbanization, which are heavily undersupplied. We need to introduce eco-design, sustainable urban spaces. There's all sorts of areas that can be done in urban food supply, already being done. Just on the service issue, this came from China. That mountain in the middle is where services are delivered to a large degree. The rest is in the periphery, which is pretty much no service delivery at all. So that's the kind of problem we are facing in terms of the challenges. And we need to build new types of urban governments, which have to be inclusive. They have to develop different forms of governance. Already said that. And the other thing about the areas of diffuse urbanization, Disickhora, call it what you will, is that they're terribly fragmented. And that governance is fragmented, and infrastructural change, environmental conflict, land use, etc. And that is the sort of processes coming from exogenous and microprocesses coming into this. So it's just a diagram to try and capture this, what I call decisional congestion. I mean, who makes the decisions and who says they can make it, etc. So policy focus may be premature. I mean, what impresses me about the papers that I heard today is they do have policy implications, but they are fine academic studies, and they're positioned within the contextual mode to a very large degree. I like to think of something I call domains of analysis, which is sort of back to feudal history domains, meaning the kind of domains which are encompassing. They will enable you to use, together with theory, a use of contextual and particular studies. I call it could be called meta-theory or meta-context, whatever you wish. And so we need to develop an approach of integrating context and theory in meta-theory at various scales. That's very important. Finally, the dilemma still remains. This is highly simplistic. I say it with great hesitation before this audience. But I see two kinds of visions. One is developmentalist, which is the kind of vision which sees pushing ahead with the growth of cities as engines of economic growth, and seeing cities, this form of developmentalism is a city is absolutely crucial to development. In this kind of, it's part of the imperative. And the other is to think about how do we create, I say cities, but I should say livable and resilient regions as places for sustainable growth. I do think we're going to be challenged by the 2050 by the issue of how well we are grasping with sustainability, urban sustainability, both in the diffuse areas outside, which I think will grow immensely in population and importance, and in the city cores and the built environment that change it. So thank you very much for your attention. Sure, if you like, yes.
Thank you for the very wide, encompassing, intellectual, not me, you, observation of these two very important countries and areas as we evolve at this point. The urbanization process, as you just described, requires all kinds of new thoughts in sectors. And one of the key points that you made for me was the tremendous demands that urban centers make on the environment and the resources. How bellicose do you think this area can become under those pressures, particularly that on the front pages of our papers in the last 2 weeks, we have China building new islands in the South China Sea, and we have a response of Vietnam purchasing 4 nuclear submarines from Russia. Is there context? What's the context? Is there war? At what point war? You said 2050 as a key point. And we're getting these numbers, 2100 or, you know. But when should we get under the table and go back to the nuclear era?
I mean, I'm dodging it because there is no doubt that if you want to talk about actions of nations in a contextual, as an element of the contextual environment of the globe, then the decision to build these islands off the coast of China and thus increase China's argument that it is legitimately owning that particular sea space is a topic which we should investigate. But in this case, I don't think it's very much connected with urbanization, but it is connected with the realities of the global world we're living in. And, you know, I wouldn't for 1 minute say that you cannot, as David Harvey has told us in his books, his many books, you cannot investigate what is occurring in our place without understanding what is occurring in the context of that place. And what about the relationships between different components of a global system in this. So, yeah, power is important. All the best will in the world to to create sustainable planning, to create more sustainable urban regions, won't go very far if someone's going to drop nuclear bombs in them, that's for sure. So thank you for your comment.
Thank you so much, especially for bringing Southeast Asia to the India-China. Finally, someone to help me. I've been trying to assert the value of bringing Southeast Asia into the India-China story, and I sort of talk about it in terms of legacies and futures, and I think we had one kind of idea of a future, you know, in terms of past hegemonies, you know, reasserting themselves in the 21st century. So I want to dig down more. So what is the value of studying Southeast Asia for the India-China comparison? Can you, I know you have a lot to say about that, but maybe a short answer.
I think it's very important. I think actually Southeast Asian countries are engaging in what are increasingly economic interactions with China and India. Just to give you, at all levels of operation, for instance, in Penang in Malaysia, which some of you may know, it's one of the sites I've worked in. The government is engaged in creating something they call economic corridor, stretching from Penang to Al-Star, which is one of the secondary cities, which is primarily a Malay area, whereas Penang is primarily Chinese. And so they're creating an investment corridor in an effort, and one of the things they're talking about is growing agricultural crops, products that will go to India, because increasingly India is having to source some things, spices, garlic, things, globally. Not all things, of course. So they're interacting, and of course Indonesia is interacting with China, and Vietnam is doing less interaction these days, but so I think, you know, there is now an East Asian, there is a kind of a structure for East Asian liaison, an East Asian treaty which exists for developing. So I see that region in East Asia and India as part of this. I mean, now Southeast Asia is centrally in the Asian nexus. And that's a very important reason. There are also lots of examples in cross-comparative studies that may be relevant. I mean, already Singapore is spending lots of investment and time transferring its planning technologies and industrial estates to the Yangtze Delta. So I think it's not only ASEAN itself, the 11 Southeast Asian nations, has been in existence for 50 years. And it is moving towards not an EU type organization, but towards an organization that will increasingly, it's virtually cut all towers between nations in the Southeast Asian region. So it is 700 million today. It will be a billion within 150 years for sure. So it's a huge chunk of global humanity, which is integrated with India and with China. So I think that's not an argument, but also there's lots of connectivity historically between India and Southeast Asian countries. Islamic contacts. There is contacts in Chinese overseas migration, which is still very important in places like Indonesia and the Philippines and Thailand and Malaysia, Singapore, of course. So, I mean, reason I added Southeast Asia to this mix was that, to be frank, I didn't want to compare India and China. I didn't want to come up with some list of similarities and differences. I mean, I had some ideas, but I would know only too well that I had been shot down on both my feet. So I didn't do it. But I do think I know something about Southeast Asia through 50 years of working in the region. And so I can use that. And I think when you read the paper, you'll find lots of examples of how that process of learning the art of comparative studies, which is also important for comparing India and China. I mean, I don't think you can compare India and China by having papers on India and papers on China. I think it's very helpful to establishing the dimensions of what you're going to do when you compare them. But on the other hand, the end product is to compare the two and try to see in what way, from a policy point of view, what is China doing that could be helpful to India? And similarly, what is India doing that could be helpful to China? Or Southeast Asia, whatever. I think in a policy context, but knowledge is also important. Knowledge of how the practice of running urban areas, managing them, is very important. It's interesting that in ASEAN they've just recently established, they like to establish subcommittees, which means that they can go to a particular city in Southeast Asia and play golf. But apart from that, they've established a committee on urbanization in Southeast Asia. So they are beginning to think in terms of how are we going to compare our experiences in order for policy purposes. So if you have the resources and you have the people and you have the incentive, why not?
Thank you.
So, Terry, thanks for making the point that I always feel like I'm making around the India-China Institute, which is that it's somewhat improperly named because we speak about it as a relationship among India, China, and the US. And yet we often find ourselves in these two comparisons. But I wanted to go back to where you started with Il Postino, the individual, right? You started with the individual, and at some point you made a comment in the middle of your talk about how gas prices go down, and in the US, people, we start selling gas-guzzling cars, and people will do what people want to do, right? And then you moved on, and you reminded us that it's so terribly important that we do this work because of the grave ecological challenges facing society. So can you go back to the postman, and tell us a story about how change happens? Because you that's where you began. You talked about how change happens, and yet you stepped back from it in the middle. So,
Fair enough. Change happens through interaction between individuals. Change happens through interaction between individuals. And knowledge formation is a very interesting process. When we did our work on hawkers in Southeast Asia, we had teams of researchers from Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, and Hong Kong. And we brought them together, and we spent months together working, trying to get our mindsets in the same pocket. But in that process was a process of information change and increase of knowledge. So the process of comparative studies, if it involves cross-national or whatever teams, then it is highly important in the development of the way people are perceiving and understanding urbanization as a process, I think. So it could be done at the individual level, it could be done at governmental level, it could be done at civil society, NGO levels. I mean, it happens all the time. It's going on all the time. The UN runs 9 million workshops a year for NGOs. So my answer to that is, yeah, the individual is important. And we know that in history. I honed to the view that individuals are very important in history. Lee Kuan Yew was highly significant in Singapore, that's for sure. Singapore would not be what it is today if he had not been there. So we got to develop into our theoretical thinking this idea of individual action. Not only individual action within a group very often. the scales. Yeah.
Can I? Yeah. Terry, I want to go back to the diagrams. You didn't show very many diagrams.
I didn't show many?
Diagrams.
Yeah, diagrams, yeah.
And I think, well, for me, one of the really important things that you did in your career is the Disickhora, research.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you can use that. It's a Southeast Asian thing, but you also expanded it into China and to India. So in a way, you've formed a platform, whether you like it or not, between both places through that diagram.
Yeah.
And so I was sort of thinking about that and as a basis for comparison. And then I was thinking, well, yeah, I could do a better one, of course, as we have conversations. But then I was thinking, well, the question of the multitude and the individual empowered from the bottom up with handheld devices and so on, altering the kind of mass society state top-down model, and we've been discussing that shift in terms of Deng and so on. And I was wondering if your diagrams could, well, what I was wondering was what was the future of your diagrams of the Disickhora, which I think is so important? How would they unfold into the future? And, what of the agriculture will remain? How will it survive? It's somehow built into the Chinese model of the definition of the city. In India, we were hearing about wells and things that So, how does that go into the future?
Well, if you want me to be positive,
speculative, if you can.
To me, it involves developing a informational and research base that establishes that forms of diffuse urbanization represent viable alternatives for urban living, in this case urban and rural living, which will respond to the threats to sustainability of urban regions. That's about the best I can do, I think. Because part of my recent work has been looking at eco-services. I'm really interested in how you can, in these areas, I like diffuse urbanization actually. I haven't used it too much, thank you, whoever else was it. I don't think he's here. Diffuse urbanization, we haven't got round to thinking about the implications for that has to how we preserve ecosystems, how we create not large engineering projects like the Ganges Canal or socially engineered huge projects, but how we develop responses that can be worked at the individual, at the household, at the level of a small local administrative unit, and so on, effectively in these areas of diffuse urbanization. And that's partly because the structure of administration in most nations is designed during the 19th century, and people have just not been able to change it. Corridors are a good example. Why don't people begin to design governments for corridors or some form of management of corridors? If you look at, say, the Tokyo-Osaka corridor, I mean, 50% of Japan's population lived there, and about 70% of economic activity. So, and yet it doesn't have any recognition at the policy level. I mean, of course, politicians recognize that it exists, but they don't want to devise a policy solution because it's working pretty well. So, that's the kind of questions that I think have to be asked, and the issue of design. I mean, I know that in architecture responses to this situation, I know that there's loads of stuff on eco-cities and on designing eco-houses and doing all this. This is all great. But so far there are about 0.001% of the built environment in most cities. So it's got to become part of a culture of sustainability. Now, you know, this is my view. I don't, you know, everybody's welcome to their own view on these issues. But I do think there's a certain inevitability about the consequences of urban growth, which is dominated by, which is dominated by the economic role of cities. And I'm not saying that it is not sensible to say that cities can't perform economic functions. Of course they do, and they have to. But what has to be done is to work out ways that that function begins to interact more with sustainability. And governments are beginning to do this. I mean, you know, they're trying to do this. But it's like a drop in the ocean. It's just not going fast enough, in my view. We need a new, someone's got to go out there and write the Bible. That's what has to be done. Yeah, thank you.
First, I wanted to thank you for a really wide-ranging and provocative talk. And I wanted to take you back to the beginning. It seems everybody is dragging you back to the beginning. I was intrigued when you were talking about the idea of knowledge production, and I was intrigued by that you brought up the idea, Jamie Peck's sort of notion of an urban impasse. And in a way, it resonated with me because I'm commenting on some papers tomorrow that are very much dealing with exactly this challenge. And I just wondered, as someone who's, as you said, done 50 years worth of contextual comparative research, whether you could say something or reflect a little bit about how you think urban studies can indeed break out of that disciplinary impasse.
Yeah, to me, I don't have earth-shaking thoughts about this. I think, first of all, you have to, and I think this is what Jamie is saying in his paper. The paper, by the way, is called Extraordinary City.
Urban impasse, it's in regional policy?
That's right, that's right, yeah. At any rate, what I think we need to do is recognize that the response to the complex nature of urban space is very difficult to manage from a speech marks disciplinary point of view. We need disciplines that are involved in interdisciplinary interaction. So we need ecological economists, for instance. We need historians who are already there, and we need geographers because they are there too. But we need lots of others, planners, urban designers, and so on, which recognize that they need to interact with the other carriers of knowledge and practitioners of knowledge in looking at cities, because you just can't plan. Although I enjoyed the paper on master plans and all that stuff today, I don't think you can plan for such complex entities in a one-disciplinary way. I think it's got to be seen. That is, if there is a virtue to urban life, it is the fact that it is highly interactive. Both in terms of transactions and in terms of everything else. So, yeah, that's what we need. We need some more thinking about how you do this. And there's been no lack of interdisciplinary conferences, by the way, that look at aspects of urbanization. They occur all the time. So people are thinking about it, but they're not thinking about it in this holistic manner. And one example is a lot of these focus on cities. Now, cities are only one component of urban space. We've got to think about urban space as part of, urban space is also part of an ecosystem. It can be national, can be local, can be regional. We've got to understand that because the whole ecosystem is certainly being challenged by some forms of urbanization. And it's amazing to me with all the great heads that exist in the world that people can't accept that rather simple fact. However, whatever. I don't lose much sleep over it, although I did last night.
So, Professor McGee, throughout the lecture you've been speaking about the region as opposed to the city or the space. And one of the issues that comes to us when we practically try and manage those regions is, as you said, we don't yet have institutions that manage regions because they are necessarily, of course, beyond the individual, made up of multiple localities, all of whom have different kinds of ideas about what their role in the region is. So how do you conceive of regional governance that will preserve a certain degree of local autonomy? Without, what do you subject to the region, and how do you get people to agree to that contract in some sense?
There are lots of examples of that happening, actually. Vancouver has a regional authority which has 19 municipalities who sit on a regional board who make decisions about certain things like transportation, overall planning, strategic policies in connection with land use, etc. And they vote according to the population of the municipalities. The situation has been that Vancouver City, which is 650,000, has generally been able, together with two other large ones, to dominate this. But recently, the growth of population in the outer region has become so much that they are now voting down the city in decision-making processes. So that's kind of interesting, but it is being done in a sense that is not causing the system to break down. So it can be done, but it involves a lot of give and take.
So
Thank you.
I'm going to join me in thanking Terry for this terrific evening.